Order the Lakewood City Council study session of August 21st, 2017 at 7 p.m. in council chambers. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Paul?
Here.
Coop?
Here.
Wickman? Gutwein?
Here.
Franks?
Here.
Harrison?
Here.
Royball?
Here.
Vincent?
Here.
Abel?
Here.
Johnson?
Here.
Shakti?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Great. I'd like to welcome everybody to chambers and those who may be tuning in off-site. I hope you enjoyed your Eclipse Day. Tonight's discussion is based upon sample ordinance regulating shopping carts. And normally on these types of meetings, our public comment is limited to that discussion. For those who may not be able to see, we have a sea of green in the audience tonight, and we have a large contingency of some folks who have a concern. So I'm going to break protocol. And again, this isn't a precedence that I'm going to set for allowing this at study session, just because the rest of the community doesn't know that they're able to just show up and speak on different things. But I will make a quick exception to that. I'm going to invite Mr. Thompson down, and I think there was one other to explain to us a little bit about what's going on, and then we will go into the regular public comment on grocery carts, and then we'll have our presentation, and then we'll have a secondary public comment on grocery carts. Mr. Thompson, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. I appreciate you accommodating us tonight. I was in the process of amending my comments to include shopping carts, and I appreciate that I'm not going to have to do that. I get nervous speaking in front of strangers, so I brought some family with me tonight. My brothers, my sisters. Apparently they got tired of sitting already. My name is Mark Thompson. I'm a representative of the Colorado Carpenters. I've been building in these communities for over 30 years, and my son has now joined me in my craft and is relying on the industry to provide for him and his family. I'd like to share with you tonight the issues in our industry and what we are up against in order to remain an asset to our communities rather than a burden. Our industry has become polluted with wage theft, payroll fraud, exploitation of a workforce by labor brokers that pay cash under the table. This means no taxes, no workers' comp, no unemployment benefits. These labor brokers normally do not pay overtime, and many times don't even pay you for the hours that you've worked. This has become common in our industry, and because these contractors and labor brokers have continued to get away with breaking the law and cheating the workforce, this in turn cheats our communities in which we live. The Colorado Mills Mall is recently under construction from the damage of the hailstorm. Simon's Property Group has made a decision to turn their head the other way, like everyone else, and allow these illegal practices to be the standard in their facility. UBS is a drywall contractor that is known for using labor brokers that exploits their workers. They currently have over 300 workers on this project from other areas that are working for multiple labor brokers that are getting cheated every day. We have approached many government agencies and elected officials, along with reaching out to developers, investors, and responsible industry partners for help to bring awareness to the criminal activity that is going on in our trade and in our communities. We continually hit a wall because it is easier to sleep at night if you refuse to acknowledge it's going on in your own backyard. These labor brokers are often involved in many criminal activities, including money laundering, human trafficking, and drug trafficking. Is this an element that you are willing to continue to allow to prosper in our community? I'm asking tonight for you to take a stand with us and stand against these activities. What can the City Council of Lakewood do to protect our citizens? I'd like the opportunity for my sister Jessica to speak briefly as well.
Jessica Penikoff here with Southwest Regional Council of Carpenters, Local 55. I'd like to know if the City of Lakewood would make sure that our city is safe from the element of criminal activity that's going on with our workers. We'd like that for us to be safe with our work and our jobs to be secure. That's all.
All right. Thank you.
Mayor, members of council, I appreciate you accommodating us tonight. We know where you're at. We know when we can make public comment now. We're asking for your help. My concern on this project, we will be out there trying to protect our industry. The police will be called, as I believe they were called tonight because of our presence. And, you know, we're asking to bring awareness and not be the ones that are at fault. Rather, hold those labor brokers and contractors at fault. Thank you for tonight.
Yep, we appreciate it. Thank you all for coming out. And just so you know, our police agents are here every Monday, so they're always making sure everybody here is safe. So, yeah, absolutely. And Mark, I'll be reaching out. I'll reach out to you, and I have your information. We'll sit down and try to figure out. This was the first instance that I think all of us were made aware of anything that's going on, and we also have your one-sheeter. So you'll be hearing from us, and we'll reach out. Thank you. Yep. Shop Lakewood. Mr. Mace. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Mace, did you hear me? I think maybe you're just waiting.
You're up.
Ms. Johnson, your light's on. I'm sorry. Was that meant to be on? Okay. Let's get through maybe public comments. Okay. Mr. Mace, good evening.
Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor, City Council members. I'm here because of the grocery cart issue. And, Mayor, as you know, I've been yanking grocery carts in back into King Supers every week since before tonight.
For free too, right? They'll
Yes.
be paying you.
For free. I've been doing it for many years, and I'm kind of getting a little tired of it. So, I first off want to thank Councilor Johnson for bringing this to council's attention, because if she wouldn't have done it, I would have. But I'm getting tired of this, so I'm urging council to pass this thing because I'm getting quite tired of it, and I'm the only one that's doing it. So, one of the things that I would like to let council know is, and the request that I have is, council, make sure that King's puts locks on the wheels of every grocery cart, because it would make it so much easier if people would stop taking this stuff off King's property. If the wheels lock up as the cart's leaving King's property, they can't do anything with it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I know you got to get out of here, so enjoy your evening.
Yep.
All right, so we have a few different names. Is there anybody else that wish to speak on shopping carts at the beginning of the round? All right. So with that, I will close the first round. And Ms. Johnson, you had a comment before we get going?
I do. I would just like to publicly acknowledge and thank the mayor for supporting this ordinance. Frankly, we wouldn't have gotten this far, and it wouldn't have gotten here tonight without your help, Adam. Adam met with one of the representatives with Safeway and a lobbyist for the retail industry and tried to work things out in a different manner, but nothing really came of that. And so again, I just want to publicly thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for your hard work on this. And what I want to mention, Mr. Cox will be presenting tonight. And so this will give us a nice beginning point for a conversation, I think. And I think it's going to be informative on maybe some different options that are out there and what best we can do to move forward. And then I want to look for some clarity tonight on what that looks like. Good evening.
Good evening. Mr. Mayor, members of council, thanks for listening in tonight as we talk about this topic. Let me start off by saying we entitled the presentation Abandoned Shopping Carts. That's not the only issue, abandonment, it's removal and its use and all that, but just calling it shopping carts didn't seem to be quite right either, because we don't care about the ones that are where they belong. We're only concerned with the ones that stray through various means. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to talk about tonight. Just 4 little subtopics. Brief amount of history, how we got to this point. We'll talk about what's being done currently by the city in this regard. We'll have a couple of sample ordinances, including the one that's in your packet. We'll review some of the key terms of those ordinances, and then we'll kind of summarize by rounding out what we've talked about and looking at some of the options for the city. The history as relevant to what we're talking about tonight goes back a couple of years when I think it was at a planning session that was sometimes called the council retreat that this topic was raised, and shortly thereafter council made the decision to assign the ACIC, the Advisory Commission for an Inclusive Community, with a review of the topic and some suggestions on where it might go. In September of 2015, the ACIC produced a report. It was a brief report, just a couple of pages. This is how they identified the task that was assigned to them by the council: research and recommend ways the city, neighbors, and stores can work together to eliminate the problem of grocery carts being abandoned, and particularly in Ward 1. And they made some recommendations, these 5 short recommendations: to continue monitoring the complaints to get a better sense of the scope of the problem, exploring ways to educate residents to contact the stores directly, hoping that the stores would take more of an active role. At that time, they recommended no citywide ordinance due to what they called a lack of effective implementation options. They urged neighborhood associations to partner with and communicate with the stores to work cooperatively, maybe to find some common areas where the carts could be controlled. And then they urged the city to consider sending something called a business courtesy notice, again to the stores, to assist them in self-regulation of this issue. After the ACIC's recommendation was made, some things were happening sort of behind the scenes. The police department started establishing contact with the larger stores. I think quarterly meetings were held. There were some reports given at various times by the police department. The city added some information to the Request Lakewood page, where what we used to call service requests, things that come in from the community, can be addressed. And there was a paragraph added there about how to contact the right people about picking up carts that are found off site. And let me be clear for anybody who's watching who doesn't know what we're here to talk about, that it is the problem of carts being taken off the premises of the stores that use them and left abandoned or continue to be used by somebody. They're expensive, they are unsightly, they tend to be found all over the place, and it's not an easily solved problem. But earlier this year, the council did identify shopping carts as one of several work items for this year's agenda, and that's how we got to where we are. We located an ordinance from out of state that we thought we could use as a jumping off point, a model, a sample that we could look at the good, the bad, and otherwise, and we prepared for this discussion. As we prepared, we continued our research and were able to find a couple of other examples that are not in your packet. The one that's in your packet is the one that we've known about for some time. As you can see, it's been modified to refer to Lakewood, so it's a little more familiar to you, a little easier to follow. But we will be talking during tonight's presentation about at least one other approach from an out-of-state jurisdiction. And the one that's in your packet is a more comprehensive, more complex approach. Just a word about semantics. We're using the term shopping carts. I think originally we talked a lot about grocery carts. As staff looked at it and realized how many and how wide the variety of stores that actually use carts, from single outlet toy stores to the big hardware warehouses and everything in between, hobby shops and the like. So I may slip up and call them grocery carts, but we're talking about the ones that hold all manner of goods. Next up is the current efforts and challenges. What's happening now in the city as we look at the possibility of an ordinance? For some time now, the Public Works Department has had its maintenance crews included among their duties is to pick up things that don't belong in the public right-of-way. That can be roadkill, that can be trash, that can be car parts or mattresses. They can also be, I almost did it already, shopping carts. They pick them up in a truck when they find them, or when there's a complaint and they go and respond to it. They hold on to them for a bit and they notify the stores that we have carts of theirs. They're usually identified by name. And sometimes the stores respond, less and less, I guess, from talking to Mr. Hutchison. They do respond, and so some of those carts end up being discarded because there's a lack of space for the city to hold on to them. It's important to note that that role is limited to public property and really public rights of way, as opposed to parks and other city property. Parks, I'm sure through their regular duties, does cleanup of such items if they are found in park property. But we're talking about the trucks going around to deal with the public right of way. There's no jurisdiction for the public works people to go onto private property. The usual course of action when somebody has something stored on private property that doesn't belong there is to go through code enforcement for outdoor storage of trash and debris or construction materials. Just learned recently that Public Works has been tracking the number of carts retrieved at least since the beginning of this calendar year, and we've received the results of that, and I can tell you that in the 7.5 months from January to the middle of this month, last week, they reported approximately 154 carts retrieved. That averages out to about 20 per month in that time frame. And if you consider that they don't typically work on weekends, it comes out to about 1 per business day in calendar year 2017. So as we look at potential options for dealing with this issue, one thing we have to ask is who should be responsible? Who's the best target for enforcement efforts? And we've identified the 4 categories of entities or individuals who can be held responsible. We have store owners who own the carts and have some interest in keeping them. The citizens who take them off the premises, of course. On some occasions, the property owners who don't move them. So if one is abandoned on private property and the city can't do anything about it through Public Works, obviously if the landowner doesn't deal with it, there's an issue there. And then there's the city as the regulatory agency and the protector of public health, safety, and welfare. So among those 4 groups, obviously the store owners do have a vested interest in hanging on to them. They don't want them to be stolen. And so they may or may not be working hard enough to prevent it or retrieve them, but they are both victim and potentially responsible party, to borrow a phrase from federal law, in this picture. And they're frequently the target because they have the resources, more so than and for other reasons like this. The citizens, second group here, who take them from the premises are directly culpable. They may have different motives, but they have the intent of taking something that belongs to someone else and taking it home with them or leaving it somewhere where it's convenient for them, and that's obviously not appropriate. But at the same time, they're the hardest group to identify and actually deal with, so that is a problem for anybody trying to regulate in this area. The owners of the property, where they sometimes get abandoned, yes, if they're left there for a period of time and it begins to look like a code violation, then they can have some responsibility as well. But typically, they're victims if the cart was dropped there by somebody else. And then the city, we do have the enforcement burden. The question is, for all of you as we discuss this, how active, how aggressive should the city be, considering use of resources, scope of the problem? That's what we'll talk about as we go forward. Again, with the ordinance in your packet and one other that we'll talk about in a minute, we'll look at some options for ramping up efforts to regulate the carts. One of the first things we did was inquire of other cities and towns in Colorado about efforts they might have made. There's no foolproof way of getting everybody to pay attention to you, unfortunately. And we had no one from representing other cities and towns respond with any kind of ordinance of their own. Helpfully, we received a video clip of a mockumentary, a parody of a documentary called Rogue Shopping Carts. Wasn't even really funny enough to include as comic relief in the middle of this. You thought it was, well, you've seen it then. But that was the most helpful thing we got out of that exercise, unfortunately, because no one we communicated with had any ordinances in this regard. The first one that we got our hands on came from Alameda County, California. Northern California, the most famous is the home of the Oakland, Los Angeles, Oakland, Las Vegas Raiders. Is that right? I missed anything? Getting there. Temporary home of the Raiders, anyway. So Alameda County, it's a 1.6 million population, roughly. And as I said, we became aware of a couple of others, and we'll discuss for the sake of comparison. So you've had a chance to look at the ordinance. If you're so inclined, we'll just review some of the key provisions. It is, in this case, in Alameda County, enforced by the Public Works Director. That's an issue that we'd want to consider is who's the best agency or officer to have that responsibility. How much flexibility would we need in that effort? And it has a number of requirements aimed at the stores, as we said, the victims as well as responsible parties who have perhaps the best opportunity to do something about it. One of the things it requires is that every cart have a sign identifying the store, identifying it as their property, contact information, a warning about the law that makes it unlawful to remove them from the premises. So those signs have to be created. The stores are each required to develop and submit a written plan to the city, to the county in this case, to prevent, the plan is to prevent removal and to improve retrieval of removed carts. And that plan can be addressed, that plan can be sent back with alleged deficiencies by the county, and the stores are expected to address those and modify the plan as needed. The stores are also responsible for paying the city's cost of retrieval. If this, we're saying city because that's what we're talking about here, but again, the county, Alameda County, has costs when they go out and retrieve carts. Those costs have to be paid by the store. We talked about a modified plan if required. And if you have an example of a repeat offender where there's repeated efforts to contact the same store and get compliance, there is a step after a certain number of offenses or a certain number of alleged offenses that they can be required to attend a hearing and, if appropriate, be required to install the sort of prevention devices that Mr. Mace referred to. That's obviously, by the way, a really good solution. The carts that just can't leave the property unless someone picks them up and throws them in the back of a truck, which defeats the purpose in most cases. But it's an expensive measure for the stores, and so they tend to resist. One of the examples that we did hear about recently, no ordinance was adopted ultimately, on that basis, the recommendation or the draft that staff had prepared for one jurisdiction did call for all carts to have the locking devices put on them, and for political or financial reasons that did not fly in that jurisdiction. But that is one option. The stores, if they fail to do any of those things, have monetary penalties to pay. If they fail to put the sign on the carts, if they fail to prepare or submit a plan, if after receiving notice they fail to retrieve any carts that the city has notified them about. And this ordinance from Alameda County does also make it unlawful for a person to remove the cart from the premises of the store, to be in possession of a cart that doesn't belong to them, or to abandon a cart. So there is an attempt to hold the individuals responsible, provided, again, they can be identified. And of course, there are now surveillance cameras in a lot of businesses and around the entrances, so it might be easier to track people down than it used to be, but it's still obviously a labor-intensive measure. So those are the key provisions of the Alameda County ordinance. If it could be characterized, it would be a fairly complex approach, the requirement of the plan, the expectation of the signs to be placed on every cart. You have to figure out how those would get affixed and how easily vandalized they could be, to have the signs removed or defaced, and a constant effort to replace them. So it's a more comprehensive approach than some, and we'll turn to one now that's a little bit less so, a little bit simpler, and probably less administrative overhead and responsibility for the city. This one comes from the city of Elgin, Illinois, and again, it's not in your materials. We just did learn about it recently. We can certainly make copies available to you. It's only a few pages. And it starts out the way we ended the discussion about the Alameda County ordinance, that it's unlawful for any person to remove a cart, to possess a cart, or to abandon a cart that does not belong to them. It also, the Elgin ordinance is also focused primarily on the stores, the businesses that own the carts. Instead of, in lieu of a sign with all kinds of information on each cart, there is a store ID. Most stores have the name of the store on the cart somewhere anyway, but it becomes required in this instance that the name of the store be on it. And then the stores are required to post notices at their entrances and exits in fairly visible, readable typeface, reminding people that it's illegal to remove carts from the store that owns them. The ordinance from Elgin also requires stores to do a sort of a sweep at the end of every business day, which I guess is every day, collect the carts that are in the parking lot, around the parking lot, the area immediately surrounding the store. It's not clear how far they try to go, but they really only have the authority on their own property, but they can expand beyond that to try and find some that have been left nearby, and at least bring those in at the end of the day. The city's role is that the city can, as in the other examples, determine that carts have been abandoned, collect them, store them, and oops, we got a little repeat information there in the second line. But the city can deem the carts abandoned, collect them and store them, can charge retrieval and storage fees. So when the store does come and collect them, they'll have to pay for the city's costs as calculated in a fee for retrieving and storing the carts. And so there's an administrative burden for the city under that ordinance, but it's a little less involved. The Public Works folks, the streets division that is responsible for the maintenance crews who go out, we asked them to look at what would be involved under the Alameda County approach in light of the requirements of that ordinance. And the streets division believed that a hire would be necessary. One individual staff person would be necessary to administer such a program. and calculated the cost of that, plus vehicle expenses and equipment expenses, one-time expenses, plus upkeep. That number came in at about $40,000 in a one-time expense, and then a total of $80,000 or so per year for the person administering the program, taking into account that the cost of benefits is typically added at about 30%. So it's a salary plus benefits calculation that comes in, again, with the initial upfront cost, real money, not insignificant. Now, that's as that ordinance was written. Certainly things could be scaled back or borrowed from other approaches. But as that one is written, it did involve enough oversight that it was believed one position would be necessary. It's something that was a preliminary review, and we can certainly look at it more closely as we go forward. So, based on what we've seen out there, what the options are, to summarize what we see as the options for the city going forward, and these are in sort of reverse order as we talked about the ordinances, but starting with what we said about what's currently happening, the city could continue that program. Public Works maintenance people can continue to collect the carts when they're notified of them. We talked about the Request Lakewood option that has a link for people to report the carts, and that could be publicized a little more and try to get more than a cart a day on average. As we look at these options, I want to keep in mind that there's really two potential goals, probably more, but there's the effective collection of carts, getting them out of sight so that they're not a public nuisance or an eyesore, and you can do that through city personnel, through requirements of store personnel that they ramp up their efforts to regulate them. But that's the sort of the short-term thing, is like delivering the mail every day, making sure you deal with what's out there and get as many of them as you can. The longer-term goal, of course, is a change in behavior. We want people to stop doing what they're doing and stop forcing other people, like the store owners or the city, from having to go and deal with the problem. When we talk about the cost of a particular approach, it's that cost shifting effort that we're trying to balance against the need to get the problem dealt with in the first place. So that's one option, is to continue and enhance perhaps what's being done by Public Works today. And the corollary to that is that, to the extent there are carts that end up on private property where Public Works people are not going to go and get them, they would be considered, if left in place, outdoor storage of junk, which is a code enforcement responsibility. I did talk with Gail Spencer, the code enforcement supervisor, and she said, estimating maybe 2 or 3 times a year it happens that somebody complains of one on private property. Typically, again, when it ends up on private property, the person responsible for the property gets rid of it, or it gets shoved out into the right-of-way, and staff has to handle it. So that's the first option. The sort of Elgin approach that we just talked about shifts a little bit more of that administrative burden onto the stores, makes them directly responsible for collecting the carts at the end of the day around their property, and then has a little less of an administrative or financial burden for the city, depending on how involved the city wants to get. That may involve some staffing adjustments, certainly has some expense to it, but in as much as the stores, when they respond and collect the carts, if they do, they're expected to pay the city's cost of retrieval, so there should be an offset there. And then, looking at the one in your packet from California, that is the more labor-intensive, more administrative-heavy approach. Not by a lot, but it is the most intensive that we've seen in the course of this research. So those are the options that we've identified. Unfortunately, we've not identified any magic bullet. As I said, they're going to be out there, and it's a question of primarily, ultimately, changing people's behavior in doing that, but at least a more effective collection technique that gets them out of sight is a valid goal as well. with that, we can turn it over to questions and
Yep.
discussion.
Well, thank you for that presentation, and I really appreciate kind of the different areas and some different examples. I have two quick questions, and one you didn't touch on, but there is a sensitivity, and there is, I guess, as you would say, due process due when it might be a cart that's holding somebody's possessions.
Yes, thank you. As soon as you started, I realized I had not mentioned that at the end as I was planning to. Right, there is an element of this, obviously, that concerns carts being used by people to transport their life's belongings. And all I would add about that is that there are due process concerns when someone is in that situation. Courts have ruled in various cases that they have a right to reasonable notice. What might be seized and taken out of carts is of more value to some than to others, and it's difficult for the government to make judgments, to pass judgment on that. So there is a risk attached to regulating carts because it can be it can drift over into that area of dealing with the homeless. And I just want you to be aware that's a topic for another whole session, but wanted you to be aware of that as we consider the options.
So to build off that, Mr. Cox, if an Elgin type, we'll just go with that, an Elgin type model was adopted, if the city contracted with an outside contractor, would they be able to access private property as well? Or would we be in the same position where they're just collecting on public right of way?
It'd be the same position with one comment that I didn't make when we talked about that. Yes, a private contractor is an option, particularly if it doesn't amount to a full-time position. So for a less intensive approach, you could contract with somebody, but they'd only have the same powers that the city would have. But I've made the distinction too broad to say private versus public. There are lots of places around the city, any city, where property is privately owned but publicly accessible. And so an example might be a business on the corner of one of the streets here in the Belmar area. Might be a convenient place for someone to drop a cart and hop on a bus or whatever they're doing, or at the bus station itself for that matter. But to the extent they're left on private property that is especially commercial, but it's publicly accessible, any person is allowed to walk up to the front door and knock and go in or whatever the business requires. So there is a little more leeway there for Public Works or for whomever is administering any kind of collection program. If they see a King Soopers cart in a parking lot of another business, they have the ability to presume that the owners of that business didn't park it there and to take it back to the store if it's convenient, or seize it and hold on to it as they do in other cases. And that reminds me of another point I should mention, and that is that even now, with the current program, if the maintenance folks who are out there collecting these things on the right-of-way, if they come upon a cart for a nearby store, they do have the discretion, they've been given the discretion to just go and put it away in the cart caddy rather than confiscate it. If it's easier or almost as easy to take it back to the store, they'll do that rather than confiscating a cart, just to save on additional work for themselves in those circumstances.
Great, thank you. And I would just say, Ms. Johnson and I had the opportunity to kind of glean through the Alameda, and I think by the time we stripped everything out, it kind of looked like Elgin. So I think when we had that opportunity to go through it and kind of call it out a little bit, it turned a lot into something a little bit less. And I'd say my only concern is, it is interesting. You look at a store is losing they're having something taken from them, right, but yet we're going to penalize them. And so how do we find that balance? And for me personally, I like a kind of a business friendly and a neighborhood friendly approach. But it seems like to me, if we could find a way to minimize staff time and input and have an outside group, do an RFP or something like that, would be a good way to go forward. And that's my 2 cents. Sure. Ms. Franks, you were first.
Thanks, Mayor Paul. Mr. Cox, out of the 20 roughly per month, did we get a breakdown on how many of those are reported and how many are Public Works finds as a natural course of the work that they do?
No, the Public Works Director has assured me that the total number includes both reported and found, but that we weren't aware they were tracking these as far back as January, and they hadn't received any instruction on distinguishing between the two. We can certainly track that as we go forward now.
Yeah, I think if we decide that we may need more metrics, I think we would want to kind of track that as well. And also on how many are reported, I think we would want to break that down. How many are reported that are on public and how many on private that then have to be carried over to Public Works, just as a way to be able to kind of see where people are depositing them, because that might give us some insight into kind of how we might need to deal with this. Also, the cost of pickup. Do we have any numbers on what that basically labor, investment is, as well as maybe the other ancillary costs that are associated? Do we know what it costs the city to recoup, to gather that cart up and store it?
Yeah, I don't think we've calculated anything like that because it's part of the collection of whatever else they find, and to the extent that they could figure out some rough percentage of how much of their time is spent on those items versus other items, we could probably come up with a rough figure for you.
All right. We also talked a little bit about disposition, that eventually, we can't store them, all of these, and if the stores don't pick them up, what is the disposition and what is the cost of that? Does it go to recycle? I don't know what they're constructed of, but what's the disposition of a fairly expensive item?
Right.
I just want to know where it goes.
Some are more expensive than others, and some are probably more recyclable than others. I think they're discarded, they're crushed and recycled. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, I am concerned about the administrative costs for something like this, so I definitely want to kind of look at that. Also, very attractive to kind of look at independent contractors who might be able to be brought in. The other thing is we may want to look at some type of a tiered approach to this, where with the stores, if we're trying to do some business-friendly, neighborhood-friendly, we may want to look at, if we ask them to capture their carts at the end of the night, it may be at the same time they can do an accounting of those, know how many they're losing, and if they're losing a certain percentage, then we may want to start to look at other mitigations. So if a store can demonstrate that through their own signage and through their own programs or whatever they're willing to do, if they're wanting to put, things on the carts or that type of thing, but they have an opportunity, but they'd also be made aware that if their escapement is more than a certain percentage of their carts, then the city would then start to move them through kind of a program in which it became more punitive as these carts got out into the public areas. So those were just more comments as we kind of move forward. And then in the one example we were given, it didn't really include penalties across the board. Was that intentional, that we didn't see like dollar figures so we could see how punitive those things might be?
There are limits on the fines that can be imposed, but we didn't want people to be distracted thinking that's what it would have to be.
Exactly. Okay. I just wanted to be sure that they would be contemplated, but they'd have some upper limit that maybe is regulated. Okay. Great. Thank you. That's all I had.
Ms. Harrison.
Thank you. Lots of food for thought here. A couple of questions that I would want to know. We have a lot of small businesses in Lakewood. Would these regulations apply to all businesses of all sizes? That would be my first question.
Sure. I think it has to be applied evenly. It's going to be disproportionate no matter how you look at it. If there's a grocery store that has 100 carts and a small business that has 3, one wayward cart for that small business is a lot more painful than 10 for the grocery store, arguably. But if the objective is to get them back where they belong on the property and to deter people from removing them, they would have to be applied evenly. There could be, perhaps, as Councilor Franks was referring to, different levels depending on what is required of the stores. Generally, you could require more, perhaps, of the stores that have a greater impact on the issue. So I think they'd have to be, but there might be ways of making that more palatable for the small business.
Okay. Second question, thank you. Second question would be, maybe a comment first and then a question. Comment would be, I believe that our shopping cart issue comes primarily from lack of transportation for a lot of people. They may be buying groceries and they don't have a car to load them into, and they might live close enough to where they're able to push it home. So I'm wondering if part of the issue we might also consider with this the ability for the store to check out or quote unquote rent at no cost, so that if I knew that I was only 4 blocks away and I didn't have a car, but I could push the stuff home, I could also push it back, make it to where I could quote unquote check it out and then bring it back. I would like to have that added as a possibility if we could think about that.
It is an interesting approach. I've heard that suggestion from elsewhere. If we get over the hurdle of figuring out who is legitimately in that situation and what the criteria would be, there might be a way to get there.
Okay.
But you're right. There are all different motives for people taking them when they do.
I think so. I think that I go by the street at, let's see, it would be about 13th and Teller, and it's by right there. There's a ditch right there, and there's always a conglomeration of about 4 or 5 different grocery carts, or one from, there's usually a Home Depot or 2 there, as well as probably a Walmart or 2 there. And then my third comment is, before we go hiring a full-time person, I think I'd much rather try contracting it out for the first year and see how it works. And then if it becomes cost effective to do that, if it does make sense to actually hire in, then let's hire. But I think the first year before we would do anything, I'd much rather contract out and have an independent contract. That's another small business that could be, very happy.
The mayor and I were talking about that earlier, about the possibility of a cottage industry that hasn't been created yet. I think
that's exactly right.
Phoenix, they have some sort of a program, and their contract is with a company called Arizona Cart Recovery Services, and that probably didn't exist before that.
We actually have one that's, I can't remember the name of it, but we do have one in Lakewood that does cart recovery. So,
thank you.
Okay, I have Ms. Johnson and Mr. Abel.
Thank you. I have a few questions and also a few comments. Obviously, we're not the only community that is struggling with this. I mean, this is a nationwide kind of a deal. The mayor and I have sat down with representatives from the retail industry and the grocery industry. They've known about this for years and have not actually looked seriously at addressing it. And my intent on bringing this forward is not to create a burden for business, but it's actually, if we look at ourselves as a stellar city, our image is also at stake. It needs to be addressed on many levels. And I think the feeling that I have gotten is that businesses have just considered this a cost of doing business, basically. They know they're getting stolen. That's exactly what it is. It's theft, and it's just their cost of doing business. But it's at our sacrifice, if you will.
Jump in on that point just to
Sure.
There's an analogy here. Our prosecutors across the way handle an awful lot of shoplifting cases in the city, and the bigger stores are more likely to get them. The national chains are more likely to have them. They report them to us, but very often when it comes time for the prosecution staff to line up witnesses, schedule hearings, and so on, the stores will say nothing. They won't respond to calls, or they'll say, yeah, well, sorry, we don't have anybody available. So they're not interested enough in enforcing that because, as you said, it's a cost of doing business. There's going to be a certain percentage of merchandise stolen in a given year. There's going to be a certain percentage of carts taken off the property in a given year. So I think you're exactly right about that.
And when you go, this is an issue that is actually more intense in Ward 1, Ward 2, and to an extent in Ward 3, in part because of the Colfax corridor. you're not only seeing these carts on streets and in ditches. I've had 2 of them on my property and basically pushed them back to ARC, and that's happened twice. I've met with their GM over there. But they're also close to the light rail at the Garrison Street station. And in all honesty, it's a matter of time before one of those carts actually get hit. And I'm not sure how that works, if it would just be bumping it off or if it would cause an accident or what. But it's out there. Couple things. I have personally been to the businesses about 10 times in the last 5 years. They don't seem to have really an interest to get engaged in this. I went to Walmart 3 times, and I know that they have the locking system on the carts. Everybody really talks about that. But if you really want to know what's going on in a place, you go to the people in the parking lot, the employees who are picking them up, and start to engage them in a conversation. And I asked the gentleman that was out there pulling the carts back up to the business, I said, talk to me. You know what? I know that these have locks on them. How does that work? He says, well, they don't want to change the batteries, number 1. Number 2, if you take it off backwards, it does not trip the whatever it is. And not only that, if you get 2 people, one on the front and one on the back, and you pick it up, you take them over that beam as well. Now the whole world knows that, because everybody that uses them knows that. So the locking system, to be honest with you, is a joke. You know, if they really wanted to get serious, they could put lights on them or they could put sirens on them. And the minute they left the property, nobody's going to take one with a siren on it. I like the idea of the signs on the carts and the business and a phone number so that people can call. You were talking about the cost for personnel for an employee to do this at approximately $80,000 a year. Could that not be covered by the fine that the stores would get?
Well, that's one of the factors we did mention, that if they're required to pay the city's cost of retrieval, at least a portion of the city's expense would be offset by that.
Okay, and you mentioned that about 154 of these have been retrieved, just kind of off the cuff. For fun, I just rounded it up to 160, took it times the number that was mentioned, $50, that's $8,000. I guess my question is, if we actually had some type of a policy in place with a sign on the cart, a number on the cart, the number of calls would likely go up. And I'd like to know if there's any kind of data, any kind of guesstimate at this point of the carts that were picked up, the 154, how many more are still out there that weren't picked up?
Yeah, as far as the records that were kept by Public Works staff, it's impossible to know that. They responded to complaints and they picked up what they saw when they could, and I'm sure there were others along the way. It's like code enforcement. We have a complaint-driven system there, because otherwise the officer would never make it back to the building with every violation that they saw on their own. And of course, we have to be conscious of the distinction between fines paid at the end of a judicial process and fees paid to reimburse the city, because right now, if they get a call, we've got a couple of your carts, they come, they retrieve them, they take them back. If they don't retrieve them, they get discarded, recycled, as we said. But if we're relying on the fees to pay for the cost of the service, and the store never responds and picks up the carts, we never get those fees. So it's not.
And then
there's
the
an expense,
cost, it's
revenue
cost
every
shifted
case.
to us.
That's right.
Okay. Well, somehow that maybe needs to be looked at, where the cost shifting is back to the business somehow, and find them to help pay for the expense of doing this kind of a thing. Also, and I totally support this, Colfax has a great deal of momentum, enthusiasm, and excitement to get the West Colfax corridor cleaned up. And when you've got grocery carts all over the place, this does not help with that image. And certainly on 14th Avenue, 2 years ago, within a 7 or 3 block area, there were 7 grocery carts. Now these happen to be from Wadsworth to about Pierce. I mean, they're all over the place. We are an all-American city, and I'm okay with being a little tough on this kind of thing, just based on the knowledge that these stores have been on alert for years that this is going on. I have been to Safeway, I have been to ARC, I have been to Walmart, and I've been to King Soopers. So I'm okay actually with the California model. I'm not sure if it's really a total fit for what we're trying to do. And I believe prior to meeting that a couple counselors kind of weighed in on it. And I think we could use that, make it better, but I'd like to see us put a little teeth into this and get somebody's attention, because we haven't been able to do that.
Thank you.
Have Mr. Abel and Mr. Roybal and Mr. Coop.
I'd like to get a better handle on what we call our cost of retrieval. What all it includes. Is it just the time it took to pick up the one cart and the gasoline and that sort of thing? If we had 200 a year, you know, we're talking $400 a cart. That would seem excessive in order. So I don't think I'd want to pay $80,000 a year for an FTE to do nothing but pick up these carts. On the other hand, the mayor referred to victimization. I look at it more as encouragement to be vigilant. If I'm not vigilant enough and I go out and I start my car in the wintertime and I go back in the house, I'm not being vigilant. And if my car gets stolen, I get fined for that. So I don't see the difference really. And I do think that encouraging vigilance is a good way to reduce crime. So I don't see this as victimization. It's just encouraging them to keep their stock in their own corral. I like the push it home, push it back idea. I'm not sure how we could enforce the checkout thing if people are just taking them now, but that might be something worth looking at. I think it's a good idea. And I'd like to know if these things are being left at bus stops, how many of them are being used to transport the belonging of folks without shelter. I think that puts it in more, would put it more in context. I do agree with Ramey. It is it's an eyesore, and it is not something we want to see on Colfax. There are a lot of, you know, along with the weeds and other problems we have there. I don't agree that it is mostly wards 1 and 2. If you've been to the Coles or seen the Coles bus or the bus stop near Coles on South Wadsworth, you see a bunch of carts there. So I think it is more widespread than we look at or than we recognize, but I think it's certainly worth controlling. And if it takes less than gentle persuasion for some of the merchants, then so be it.
Thank you. Let me respond to a couple of the things you said. I think I was the first one to use the word victim just as a way of pointing out the unique role that the stores have in this. And in discussions with others this morning, I used the same analogy to a stolen car. You left your keys in. You didn't want it to happen. You certainly, somebody else had the intent to break the law, but you pay a price for that as well. The cost, I would say the cost that we'd be concerned about with a more intensive program is the administration of the plans, reading all the plans, returning them for revisions, keeping track of whose carts have been brought in. The retrieval would still be done by a laborer who's out there anyway. And as we talked about earlier, we could probably come up with a rough percentage of time spent and what the cost of that time would be in terms of fuel and wages and so on. So it's more about the office administration than it is about the cart retrieval. Yeah, and I'd love to get a count of how they're being used. Oftentimes when they are used by homeless folks, they'll go off to a little camping area someplace out of sight, out of mind. It's obviously hard to keep track of them, but it would take some effort to try to pin that down.
There is one more thing. You mentioned that if it's on private property, then the private property owner gets rid of the shopping cart. How does one get rid of a shopping cart? You put it on somebody else's property?
I suspect what happens more often than not when it does end up that way is either nothing because it's maybe in a ditch out of sight and they're not that concerned about it, or it gets pushed to the sidewalk and left in the public right of way. I doubt there are very many homeowners and even business owners who are paying to haul them away and dispose of them.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
I would agree with the victimization, but the analogy though, 200 people don't have access to your truck. So it's a little bit harder to be vigilant, when you have but I understand where you're going with it.
200 people want access to my truck.
You heard it here first. The other thing I was just thinking before I go to Mr. Roybal, maybe there's a way to create like a community cart, because that is somebody's way to get their groceries to a public transit. And so maybe it's a community cart that can be brought and there's a reward if it finds its way back of like 50 cents or something like that. That would help get it back. Just food for thought.
Along the lines of the bike rent,
Yep.
borrowing,
The airport,
and even the cars. That is certainly a possibility to create a fleet that would be available for.
We could have them done up in art in the theme of our arts district. Mr. Roybal.
Thank you, Mayor. A couple of things came to mind. Councilor Franks came up with a great idea, and I echo that too, but I'd like to take it a little bit further. Some of the stuff that I looked at, the carts are the ones that we push behind. I've also seen a few of them that we have the American Disabilities Act. They have individuals sitting on these little rider carts, and they take them down 2-3 blocks. They get up and they walk off, and they don't take them back to the grocery stores or wherever they got them from. Now, my question is, and I've asked several different companies what the cost of those carts are. And one big major corporation said that they're about $500 a piece. So looking at that, and then I'd like to see if we can take a look at maybe helping these companies come up maybe with suggestions of new technologies to help them keep their carts in their corral, so to speak. I know we have the batteries that go dead on the carts and they have a hard time changing them. And yes, we should keep them, accountable for that. Kind of looking at maybe we can do other things to help so they don't get out of the corral in the first place. Adam came up with a great idea of maybe having a small stipend reward or something from the company to make sure that they get them back. It is expensive. Those carts are very expensive, and every time they lose one, they end up paying a lot of money. So it would be vested for them to stay on top of it as much as they can. That being said, their challenges are now becoming our problems in the easement right away. And I kind of looked at it, and Public Works, we have vehicles going all over the place. If we can have one central place where they can take the carts there and create a fee structure for actually doing that and putting them there, giving them notification, sending them the fee for each cart directly, and then just telling them you got X amount of days to come pick up your carts. If not, they get disposed of. And I think that's the simplest way to actually use it. And you'd be surprised once you start getting rid of some of their carts and you tell them, we're getting rid of it if you don't come pick it up. And by the way, here's the fee for us picking it up. I think they would change their attitude very quickly when it costs them money. But that's just my comment. But I'd like to also include the handicap carts in that when they have the signage and everything and where it came from. But again, I think we should put the burden back on the person that owns the cart. So just my thought.
And a couple of thoughts on that very quickly. Getting back to what Councilor Johnson said about the locks, they certainly are not foolproof, and I'm assuming somebody's out there working on better technology to get the job done. You go back to the ACIC report from 2 years ago, and there was a chart listing various businesses and a column for locks. So yes or no, do they use locks or not? And 2 businesses responded yes, and both said broken, no intention to replace them. So they had tried it, it didn't work, the batteries died, what have you. In terms of the fee to be paid for coming to retrieve the carts, unfortunately, we're seeing that already, that even without the threat of a fee, they're not coming to get the carts. They're willing to, again, as a cost of doing business, willing to sacrifice a certain number of carts and save the administrative hassle of going to get them. At least we're assuming that's the thought process, in some cases anyway. And with regard to the electric sit-on carts, I think if it weren't for child labor laws, you could hire 10-year-old boys and they'd love to drive them back to the store. But I don't know how else to get them there. But they should be included, obviously, because they're even more expensive than the usual carts.
Put the burden back on the person that owns those carts. It's their responsibility. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have Mr. Coop, Ms. Vincent, Ms. Shakti, Ms. Gutwein, Ms. Franks, Ms. Harrison.
Mr. Cox, you had mentioned earlier that there were quarterly reports, meetings with the police department in these, I guess, a certain amount of businesses that have a lot of these carts. Do you have any synopsis or any flavor for what the businesses were saying during these meetings?
I really don't. It was, I think back 2 years ago when the report was done by the ACIC, that's what prompted. Was it Dutch Smith in the police department was in charge of that program. I haven't had a chance to talk to Dutch since I was reminded about that effort, and that was under former Chief Paletta, so I don't know how much information Chief McCaskey might have on that, but we can certainly find out what happened at those meetings and see if any progress.
I think that would benefit this body very much, because knowing what the people that are actually having to deal with this, what their beliefs were, what their hardships are. You know, as far as we know, maybe they don't care, or maybe they really, really do care and are looking for some sort of help. So I think that would help me.
We'll try to track down any.
Pardon me, can I interject? I was a part of those meetings about 18 months ago, and we met with representatives from Walmart specifically, and Walmart indicated to us that they do have people that once they're called and are alerted that there's a cart out in the community somewhere, they'll dispatch a person, an employee, to go out and pick up that cart. Some of the difficulty is, and from that, we then, I think we put on the website all of the phone numbers of the different retailers that are in Lakewood with phone numbers to call if indeed you see a cart out in the community. Walmart had told us that they go out frequently and do kind of a sweep around their area to pick up carts that have gone astray. We have had some complication with the staff at some of these retailers because of the change, because there's a pretty high turnover in the management of these retailers. So that was an issue. I do know, though, after Chief Paletta left, that Chief McCaskey has picked up attending those meetings, and we try to keep a real good relationship with our retailers. Not just to talk about shopping carts, but also other issues like crime and how to be good neighbors, etc.
Were these meetings only with Walmart?
The one I attended was, I believe, just Walmart, but we had the different representatives from the different Walmarts in Lakewood, as well as their security team attended. I believe we've had meetings with other retailers as well, just to talk about issues that we're finding in the community. We can get a more detailed report if that'd be helpful as well, to give you an update.
Thank you. Also wondering, does each Walmart deal with this individually, do you know? Or is it a kind of a system-wide thing? They have one person that takes an area around and takes those carts to that closest place, or do they just drop them off anywhere, do you know?
You know, that's a good question. I was under the belief when we talked to them that each one had their own kind of dispatch team that would go and pick up carts around about a quarter-mile radius around their facility.
Good. Cool. Thank you. Some questions, and I don't know if this would be from Public Works, but the carts collected by the Public Works employees, are they stored in one location?
I believe there is one location that they're stored in now. It's probably not adequate for a central storage place if we were to intensify efforts. And that's one of the costs that was calculated in by Public Works staff, is locating a space for storage. There are a couple of possibilities, and then office space. There's no room in the streets division now for anybody else if there were to be a need for hires. But yeah, I think there is one central location, and it's just not that big.
Okay. And when these carts are recycled, are they disposed of in the regular recycling where the city gets paid for the steel or the plastic, whatever they're made of?
I assume they would go there, but that I don't know. Yeah. Jay, do we know that to be true?
Jay Hutchison, Public Works Director, will respond.
Yes, Councilor. The carts are taken actually to the quail disposal site and included with other metal disposal there. You may remember we segregate different types of material there, so it's handled that way.
Are they disassembled? Or because some of them have plastic and metal.
Yeah, crushed might be a better term.
So it's just all, okay, very good. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
Ms. Vincent.
Thank you. First, Mr. Mace, you'll be very glad to know that there's a gentleman in our area who pays kids 50 cents per cart to take back. So you're not alone. The other thing is I have found, and I'm just going to comment at this, that often what I have found so far, and it's not hard data, is that I have witnessed people who take carts from a Walmart or whatever, don't take them back. They just go to Walmart and get a new cart, and sometimes there's 3, 4, 5 of them that are stacked up in front of their house, so they don't take them back. Would apartment parking lots be considered public?
Well, again, if it's a private development, the land is privately owned, but as with places of, single-family homes and businesses, absent the no trespassing notices, you can walk across that property in the publicly accessible area. There's a lot of law on this in the code enforcement context as to where it's okay for someone to go, but unless someone's telling you you're not allowed to come on the property through trespassing signs, you can go on to those areas. What you do once you get there is another story. But yeah, okay. The same would be true with an apartment building.
Great. And a while ago, we had a gentleman who was paid, which I have not heard brought up yet, which was paid by the different stores to return carts. So they picked them all up and then dropped them off and got paid so much per cart. Do we know what happened to him, or is that something we've looked at? Because that would seem not to be a burden on us.
I had heard that at least one of the major chains had hired an individual. I wasn't sure if that's the same person who was supposedly working for all the individual stores. I don't think it's having much of an impact if they're still out there doing that. But
okay.
Every little bit helps, I guess.
Because I don't know if maybe that's something we could look at too, because the stores were responsible for that and they paid for it. And all you did was call him up and he'd make a sweep in the areas. I think, and what is it that if you find grocery carts in places that have been there for a long time, that are now full of trash, et cetera, you said you called code enforcement and it was called a what?
Well, it'd probably fall under the heading of a nuisance.
Okay.
You know, there are lots of things you can do on your property that would violate the code. Storage of outdoor materials, of junk outdoors, or construction materials that are not part of an ongoing project. So whether it's filled with anything or just left there, at some point it becomes junk because it doesn't belong there. That's a code enforcement matter.
All right, thank you.
Ms. Shakti?
I think 154 carts is a lot. I also think that I don't want to see us spending all that much money on what to do with shopping carts. That $80,000 is a lot of money that could be used for other things, and even a whole lot less than that would seem like too much to me. That said, I wonder, I don't know clearly what the solutions are, but I wonder, like, are there certain areas where we're seeing the carts taken and the carts going? So is this, no, it's really all over the place.
And we do have areas that are higher concentrated, but really anywhere near, I think, a larger retail store and a bus stop, you're going to see them.
So bus stops, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
of which there are many.
Transit locations.
I think the idea of rewards is interesting, except that it does create an incentive to steal cards. But the idea that there might be some fairly inexpensive, non-bureaucratic solutions, which is an easy thing to say when you haven't thought of them, but there we go.
Thank you, Ms. Shakti. Ms. Gutwein.
That is tough to follow. But okay, couple questions. How fast is Public Works getting to the carts, would you say? Or same day, that week?
Hard to know because we don't know how many of them are responding to a complaint and how many of them are just observed.
They're just finding them. But if it was so I'm wondering, is an independent contractor going to get to them faster than Public Works, or probably about the same, or just no idea?
Well, if their focus was narrower, if they were only there to pick up carts when they get reports of them or when they see them, then they're spending less time than the maintenance crews do, who are responsible for other things as well.
Okay. Thank you. And the other question I have is, so what we're talking about potentially is having a fee for the stores. And I was just wondering how this looks in terms of collecting taxes and fees for our city. And
always a concern when you talk about imposing any kind of tax or fee or recovering any kind of revenue. Tabor becomes a factor. Any fee is a fee if it is tied to the service provided directly and not just a source of revenue for the general fund. So there are things you have to do to make sure that what you're doing is imposing a fee against the person who's responsible for generating the expense, rather than just taxing someone to pay for government services generally.
Okay. And so are you saying, if as a fee, we'd have to have like a shopping cart enterprise fund or something, or
if it truly is a fee, if it meets the definition of a fee as opposed to a tax.
As opposed to a tax, then we can just collect it and it doesn't hit our Tabor revenue.
That's right.
Okay. Well,
Yeah, no, two separate issues. One is it a fee or a tax? Because a tax has to be approved. If it's a new tax, generally speaking, it has to be approved by the voters.
Right.
If it's a fee, there's still a revenue component, which if you collect a whole lot of
It would be subject to Tabor.
the revenue would be subject to Tabor, but you could impose the fee without
Without a vote.
Yes. Right.
Okay. So it would impact our revenue for Tabor refund.
Yeah, if you have a new source of
And I recognize it's a relatively small number that we're looking at, but I just wanted to understand that. Okay. So then my other question, I really love that idea that Mayor Paul just brought up about the community cart and what Councilor Harrison was saying about just understanding kind of what the root cause of this issue is, and is it a transportation issue mostly, which I think we kind of recognize it probably is. And so I like to kind of steer the conversation in that direction of trying to make people's lives better as they're facing these issues, instead of as we hopefully can solve this problem. And so I guess I like a carrot better than a stick. And so I'm wondering if there are other incentive-based programs that you saw in your research.
No, nothing that we stumbled upon, but the ideas are out there. When we talk about rewards, that can obviously be, these are businesses that have all kinds of, whether it's coupons, vouchers, gift cards, and things that they can make available to people, and the city can do the same sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Because I think, for example, when you go to the airport, you have to pay $5 to get the cart, and then you put it back and you get your $5 back, which I never do because that $5 is an outrageous amount of money to pay for a cart. But anyway, then that encourages people do that for recycling too in other countries, where you pay an additional fee, then you get that fee back when you return the cart. So I'm just kind of throwing that out there. So at the end of all of this conversation, I really want to make sure we're keeping our sidewalks accessible. And I always think about James when we're talking about this issue. And I'm also really concerned about the cost of this kind of program and the administrative cost of this kind of, especially with the California option. I would not probably support spending $80,000 to run a program like this. I'm not sure that's the best use of taxpayer dollars, and I think there are other full-time employees that maybe our community could benefit from more. Sorry, this is the last question, is what would be the cost of just continuing to do what we're doing, which is picking up the carts and bringing them back, having Public Works just continue to do that?
To get any kind of helpful estimate, as Councilor Frank suggested early on, we'd need to get an idea of how much of the time of those individuals is spent on that task, if it's possible to break that down. And there's obviously a cost for them to be out there doing it, along with their other duties. But
it's currently fitting within someone's current full-time duty. They're not getting paid overtime, for example.
Right.
Okay, so and the very last question is the signs. I think it's important to have that sign on the cart saying what the store is, what the phone number is, it's against the law, or please return it, or whatever. Could this kind of sign be considered part of our other sign ordinance?
Well, the sign ordinance is undergoing a major overhaul, is because of Supreme Court precedent.
Food for thought. Maybe if we did have an ordinance, maybe it could just be part of the other signs. So I don't know, because I think I would be hesitant to pass an ordinance related to this, but I think it would be good to have the signs. So I would like to just maybe continue doing what we're doing, and look into incentivized programs and community cart?
I think on the sign code question is one we can chew on for a while, but the obviously in terms of cost and business friendly regulation, we saw one ordinance where they require a sign that has all this information on it. It's got to be on every single cart, and it's got to be replaced when it's not there or it's damaged, versus the other ordinance which said put up visible signs entering and exiting the store. One's a whole lot cheaper than the other and a lot easier to manage and maintain. So that's a policy decision you make. Is the sign on the cart that much more effective? Maybe it is, but it might be worth the extra money to the store if it gets them their property back and saves the city from having to get involved on it. So,
Ms. Franks?
Just have a couple more things to throw out there for food for thought. We all know that GPS tracking of even micro objects is getting cheaper and cheaper. So there might be a way, either short or long term, to look at encouraging the stores to add the GPS tracking to the carts. Really inexpensive, and what it does is, I know that right now we're saying they don't want to replace the batteries and the going off site, but a GPS tracker allows them to assess their shoppers' behavior while they're in the store, so they're actually getting some benefit by seeing where people are shopping and moving around. So there's a nice cross benefit. So I just wanted to throw out that those little trackers are getting down to where they're like $10, $15 a pop. So we're not talking about a lot. Obviously you'd have to mount them, but there's maybe a cross benefit with the stores, an incentive to say you're getting some intelligence based on however they'd want to implement that. Also, while I was sitting here, I did look and see about other folks that are dealing with loss prevention, and there was just one statement in there that caught my eye saying that you may need to look at multilingual signage in order to address a broader population. So I just wanted to throw those two things out there as additional items to consider.
Well said. So I still have Ms. Johnson, Mr. Coop, and Ms. Shakti. Let me just do a quick summary so I'm staying, in line with what I'm trying to follow. We have some folks that want to see Alameda and go heavy. We have some folks that don't, and some folks in the middle. And a couple things that I might suggest we look at to help move us forward is looking at what I would say is the softer Elgin model with some signage. The idea of looking at a recovery team, which kind of goes to what Ms. Vincent talked about, how there is a company, but this would just be somebody that we would set out. And of course, there's a penalty side to that. So you'd have signage, recovery, and some sort of penalty. And then as far as the community cart or the issues that we see with some of our folks who may need to take that for other reasons, maybe that's an ACIC assignment to try to have them dig in a little bit further as to what that would look like, or how we can better create a program with the stores so that if you're going from even this, you see them right down here at the bus stop, because folks come from King Soopers and take their groceries down to the bus stop. So how could we figure out a more creative way that it doesn't, still allows people? So that's kind of a quick summary, and I'd like us to get closer to something here in the next few minutes to give staff some direction on how to move forward. Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. I'd like to respond for a few things here. Because of the length of time that this has been going on and the business's knowledge of this, and they don't seem to have had the ability to find an answer. And basically, as I said, they feel it's a cost of doing business. I think that I am more comfortable actually with taking a little bit of action that shows that there is some teeth in something. And again, we don't know that how many 154 carts represent as far as the total number out there. My feeling is that if there was some kind of an ordinance in place that got a message to the businesses that we're all partners in this, we're all looking at a way to make our city be the all-American city it is, and they're part of the solution as well, that the amount of carts, I think, actually would go down over amount of time. They would find a way to make sure that they do stay on their property. Karen was talking about the place over at 13th and Teller, and I've been there as well. I took a picture one time. I think there were 6 of them. And the time that I went, I think they were all from Home Depot, frankly. I've spoken with that manager as well and pointed it out to him, and 2 weeks later they were still there. So relying on the business to pick them up in a timely way, I'm not sure what's going on there, but it's not happening. And again, the comment was made about taxpayer dollars. If this is a fee structure, the fee should pay for the program, and it should not be coming out of the general fund. The idea to have the sign on the cart with a phone number so that any of us, you see a cart, you call the number, you're telling the business, you've got 72 hours. Here's where your cart is. It's nice to have a GPS, but this is also another way for citizens to be engaged and to be part of the solution and to get the carts off the street as well. Just a few of my comments.
Okay, so I have Mr. Coop, Ms. Shakti, and Ms. Gutwein.
We've heard a lot about Public Works dealing with shopping carts. Has Parks employees been involved?
It's not part of the same program, but there are maintenance people who work in the parks and take care of things that don't belong there. So we don't have any numbers for you. We can certainly look into that.
Can I ask Mr. Hutchison if he knows if they are if Public Works comes to the parks to pick those up, or are they delivered? Is there any information
Ms.
about
Hudson?
them?
You go first.
I suspect that Parks just takes care of that in their routine business and dealing with whatever else they need to deal with in the park. So I don't know the specific answer to your question. I certainly don't know any numbers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
So in my experience as a parks person back in the day, there are designated crews that pick up trash at all of the parks, and often other things are dumped in the parks, and the parks crews pick that up as well. So park staff see all kinds of things left in parks, and that would include carts, and they just take them away.
Do the parks people have recycling capabilities like Public Works does?
Well, sure, they have access to the recycling center on Quail. Yes.
But we don't know if that's where the carts are taken.
You know, we haven't asked that specific question about carts, and we can do that. So I'm sorry I don't have that.
That's okay, thank you. There's a lot of talk about fees for retrieval and storage. Has there been any contemplation on what that would be yet?
No, not at this point. There are ways to figure those kinds of things.
All right.
People who are
Thank you.
smarter with numbers than I am can figure out. So.
Thank you.
So I have Ms. Shakti, Gutwein, Harrison.
So I just feel like I need to spend another minute on what I understand is the Tabor implications. So if I understand it that basically whether we charge a fee or pay the money ourselves, we are losing the same amount of ability to spend money because we are up against the Tabor cap. And so however much the quantity of the fee is, that's money that can't be used for senior rides or whatever people want to use it for. So it makes the fee a less obvious solution than it might seem otherwise without the Tabor complication. I feel like I don't want to waste staff's time in terms of do we move forward with the signage recovery and penalty. I think the numbers would matter a whole lot on how big a thing we're talking about. Although signage, I think, seems like it's probably pretty not that expensive. I don't know for sure. It seems like there'd be some kind of signage that could be done, but that's all.
Great, thank you. As you can tell, we have very different opinions and unique individuals up here. I love it. Ms. Gutwein.
Just one question. I thought I heard that the fee does not cover the cost of running this program? In other,
If you're imposing a fee, it has to be closely tied to the cost to the city for that service. So if you're talking about a retrieval fee, then it's a calculation of what it costs to send someone out and have them stop, pick up that cart, bring it back, send the notice or give a call, whatever they do to notify the store. That has a calculable cost. Just as the storage, you can figure it occupies this much space, we have this much space available, we could be storing other things here, so you can figure out a rough idea of what the cost is to the city on a per day basis. And so if you charge a fee, it's to cover that service, not necessarily, it may or may not include, well, it will include some time of whoever's administering it, whether it's a contractor or an employee. They're the people moving things around, keeping track, whatever it is. There's a way of coming up with some kind of figure that at least you can justify is appropriate for the expense it's attempting to cover.
So
it's not going to cover the whole cost.
even with the fee, it doesn't cover the whole cost, and our taxpayers would be paying the difference.
Well, what we're doing now, we're paying people to go out there and pick up stuff that shouldn't be there, and that's a service to the community. It costs the city to do it because we're not getting anything back for it, but it's a service the city provides. It'd be in that category.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
Ms. Harrison.
A question and then perhaps a comment. Question would be, if we were to do this, I think that these losses that a business would take would actually be, it's just like shoplifting. It's going to be handed down through the cost of the product that they sell. So that's one thing that I would be concerned about. Second issue would be, is there a way that rather than crushing the shopping carts, there are a lot of nonprofits and other places that could probably buy or repossess or whatever you want to call those shopping carts. I'm thinking of the beautiful junk sale that the Action Center has. They're always looking for extra shopping carts for that particular event. And I think that, there'd be lots of other places that we might be able to, offload a bunch of carts that way. So,
yeah,
or even sell them.
At least theoretically, there could be a market for them. The question is how much time and money do we invest in keeping them, advertising them, notifying people of sales or what have you. So everything has a cost, even a charitable effort like that.
All right, Mr. Roybal.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm in support of this ordinance or this idea. I do have questions on how we move forward once we take the carts. I think we're all losing the perspective. Why are we doing this in the first place? Is to get the carts out of the streets, get them out of the right-of-ways, get them away, get them back into the stores where they belong. And I think that's where we need to stay focused. So my thought is, after reading a lot, talking to a lot of companies, I think that once we create an ordinance and we let the stores know that we're serious about this, I think they'll start retrieving their own carts. Their carts are expensive, and they'll take charge of it. And I think the cost or the actual monthly carts that are out there, you're talking about 20 carts a month, roughly. I think it'll drop down to 1 or 2. I mean, we're still going to have them, but I think if we create a positive venue to let the businesses know, hey, we're not going to tolerate this. This is what we have. This is our intention is. Just letting you know that you have to accept responsibility for your carts. So that's just my 2 cents worth.
Mr. Abel?
I'll try to make it quick. A lot of the arguments I'm hearing here, you could apply to any code enforcement ordinance we have. Tabor implications. It applies to all of them. Cost recovery. We don't recover all of our costs in any of the code enforcement areas that we collect fines or fees on, I'm sure. So I'm not sure those arguments have a lot to do with the issue at hand. Our code enforcement is built around, in large part, getting rid of eyesores, weeds, junk piles, lumber piles, dead limbs, mattresses, thank you. So we don't recover all of our costs, but we do contribute to the appearance of our community. And that's what code enforcement's largely about. So I would suggest we ignore the red herrings and apply this like we would our judgment to any other eyesore. Thank you.
And I would just say I think it's just different opinions in the way people see things differently in their own areas. So, and that's okay. So let me get to this. So we have an option, and I need to start calling this down to see where we go. So I'll start with the one that's presented as is tonight. Is there support to see that go forward into a permanent ordinance? The California Alameda. Yeah. Okay, I see. No, yes, no. Okay. So then is there, on the flip side, consensus to do nothing? No. Okay, so there's no, so we're going to do something. And it doesn't look like we're going to adopt the Alameda, and we can test that, but it sounds like it's something in the middle. And so, Mr. Abel?
Can we look at something in the middle? Something that maybe would blend both things, maybe not be so heavy on the administrative side, a little more simplistic. I do like the idea that if you remove, possess, or abandon somebody else's property, that you can be found to be liable for that. So I think maybe if we meld these things together and simplify, but keep some teeth there, we'll find the solution.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that's kind of where I was trying to push, was the signage recovery and the means, the mechanism of some sort of, hate to say penalty, but we're just not gonna, they're not gonna be stored for nothing. We can't do that. Ms. Vincent?
Yeah, I just need to clarify signage, because we've talked about it at the store, but we've also talked about it on the carts. I would favor something at the stores rather than each individual cart.
Okay.
You don't agree with that? Okay. You want it on each individual cart?
Well, we can get there.
Okay.
Okay, so
all right, I'm cool.
Okay. Ms. Gutwein?
I just wanted to say that, of course, I support keeping our community beautiful and investing in doing that. We have a finite amount of resources, and I just always wanted to spend them as efficiently as we can. And I am more than happy to consider looking at a middle ground. So thanks.
Ms. Johnson?
I'd just like to say if the carts have a sign on them with the business and a phone number, then it gives the person that finds it the ability to know who to call. It gives the business the ability to know it's there and for them to pick it up and avoid all of the administrative fees and all of the hoopla down the road. You can do it upstream rather than downstream that way.
I know you're just jumping to get in here.
No,
hold on.
Yeah,
hold on real quick.
I had one other comment, but I'll save it for.
Okay. All right. So what if we direct staff tonight and to take a look at something similar to what we've heard is Elgin, which is in the middle of the road, but to start to look at something that deals with signage. Is everybody in agreement on signage? I'm getting a majority on signage. On recovery. Okay, so I have majority consensus on recovery. And unfortunately, there's a fine aspect, and that's just the reality of what we're doing. Okay, so we have those defined. Wait, Ms. Harrison?
I just really want to add, if there's a possibility to consider doing individual contractors and or, as what Sharon talked about, especially to start out with, to get a feel for what kind of expense, because I don't want to take on another FTE if we can figure out if it's less expensive to do it by contract.
My understanding of this model is it is somebody, so we'd go out and bid this.
Okay,
and
thank
we
you.
would hire somebody. Ms. Hodson?
Sure, that's an option.
Yep.
That model can go either way, with a staff person or with a contracted person. And to add some clarification when it comes to signage, when we come forward with a proposed ordinance, we'll put signage. How about if we put signage both on the stores and on the carts, and you all that gives you time to kind of think about and decide if you indeed want to do both or one or the other, or however. So we'll include both. Does that sound good?
And I think the main intent, we want to keep it neighborhood friendly and business friendly, and, try to just work together in a more meaningful way, and, keep the city looking nice. And then Ms. Franks brought this up, but, the community card, or that idea of what do we do to help people who use these as their transportation? And they're going to go to the bus stop and they're going to get on the bus and go home. So that cart's going to be there. So would that be an ACIC assignment to try to figure out, or Ms. Shakti?
I just think it depends what we do. It might make sense to wait and see what we do to.
Fair enough. Mr. Abel?
I'd like to remind that the use for transportation extends to folks who have their belongings in the cart and take them to where they stay each night. So we might want to consider that as well. There are legal implications there that Mr.
Absolutely.
Cox pointed out, so, as well as a humane issue.
Yes, indeed.
Absolutely.
Okay, so is that clear enough vision 2020?
I think it is. We have a lot of notes, and it looks like you want to model this similarly to the Elgin model. The issue with signage would be placed on stores and on carts themselves, with identification of the store and a phone number for retrieval. We would have to work on what that recovery would look like when the city picks up a cart, and how the whole recovery process. We'll need to have that conversation internally to kind of make some recommendations, and then think about penalty or fines associated. And then I think we need to do a little more work in terms of individual contractors that are available, of what that might look like as an option in lieu of an additional full-time employee. So we'll work on this and come up, and you all can, and we'll have a draft copy, and you can look at that and make whatever corrections, modifications, deletions that you'd like.
Appreciate that. In the meantime, could we please have the Elgin sent to the city council?
Yes, we're happy to do that.
So a good understanding there. And, okay, cool. We all good?
Yes.
All right, fantastic. Mr. Cox, you wanted to say something else.
Oh, well, I was just going to get on the soapbox for a minute. I think, we talked about the attitudes that the stores may or may not have. We can't say in any given case how many of them are apathetic and how many of them are just, business people who don't look at certain factors. But, there's a communal aspect to this. They have to want to be part of the community, because it doesn't speak well of their business to have their carts lying around all over town. Now, there might be store managers who think any publicity is better than no publicity. Oh, Home Depot, I just remembered I need a putty knife. But otherwise, it doesn't speak well of them. Just as fast food restaurants have to be concerned about picking up trash that's going to accumulate, the conscientious ones are going to do it, the others are not. So in talking with the businesses, I think the more we can do to get them to want to cooperate, the better off we'll have.
I'd hate to see one of Timbuk Toys' little mini shopping carts get taken. But with that said, and to the credit, we have had some conversations, and the folks that we've reached out to, they understand, and they haven't said, no, we're going to fight you. They've said it's a challenge, and, somebody had said it's clearly evidenced by the fact not many people have these types of ordinances because it's tough. So, Ms. Shakti.
I was just thinking that when you get a parking ticket, that's not under our Tabor limit. So anyway, if there's some way to structure it so that it's not under the Tabor limit, that'd be great.
Sure. There are different kinds of revenues are treated different ways, including criminal penalties. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. We are done. Thank you. So I'll go into open up the last round of public comment. I jumped the gun. Nobody wished to sign up, but Mr. Mace, you've stayed. Would you like to speak? Yes, all right. Come on down. Okay. Welcome back.
Thank you. To answer the question of the store who hired the person to pick up the carts, that person that was in picking up the carts, their responsibility was to pick up the carts. How much they were getting paid was $1 a cart. So I asked that question a while ago and they said $1 a cart. But you do have to realize the person's gas. They were using their own personal gas and the stores weren't paying for it. They were only giving them 4 quarters a cart. And the other question is, if I'm understanding correctly, is the signage. Yeah. How many carts are at the bus stop? Thousands. When this whole thing started, I picked up at least 15 to 20 carts a day, one at a time, because I can only pull 1 cart at a time on both sides of the bus stop. Not only at the bus stop, but at the parking garage as well. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else wish to talk about grocery carts? All right, I'll close public comment. And we'll go to reports. If you had the opportunity to come out to Cops That Cook, it was a fantastic event. And yes, that was turkey sausage, so it was pretty healthy. Did you know that? It was good. It tasted good. So, good event, and I think one of the biggest turnouts that we've had. So, thank you to our police for all that they do. Just a reminder, school is back in session. So when you're out there, look out for those little kiddos running around. And then had the great opportunity to go and watch the ribbon being cut on Rose Stein Elementary. And that was a great community event, a great community school. And those kids have a bright, bright future. I'll start all the way down on my right with Mr. Coop, Ms. Gutwein, Ms. Franks, Ms. Harrison, Mr. Roybal.
Just wanted to mention real quick, we had our community picnic at Addenbrook Park, and it was fantastic. So thank everybody for coming.
Ms. Vincent.
Yeah, hi. There seemed to be a discussion, perhaps about a donation that I took after my election from an entity. And I just wanted to address that because I told that person when I accepted that check that I would only do it if I could give it to charity. To make a long story short, what happened was I got sidetracked. I lost my job and a bunch of other things happened. So when this was brought to my attention, I just wanted to let everybody know that I did follow through on that. I closed my account, and all the money that I had, which was only like $300, I did give to the Jeff Go Action Center. So that was taken care of.
Very cool. Mr. Abel? Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. I would just like to thank all of council tonight for your honest and thoughtful questions and comments. regarding grocery carts. This has been out there for quite a while. And between all of us and all of our experience in all of our different wards, we're going to come up with an ordinance that is perfect for the fit of Lakewood. And I want to thank you. And then the last thing I'd like to say is that about a week ago, I went to the funeral of John Tracy. Many of you may know him. He was the publisher and editor for the Sentinel, or he was with the Sentinel, I want to say, for 34 years. And goodbye, sweet friend. Thank you.
Ms. Shakti.
Today, my husband and I drove 12 hours to see the eclipse, and it was totally amazing and worth it. So that was great. And then Saturday ward meeting, I'm going to miss the Saturday ward meeting because there's a Denver Regional Council of Governments retreat. But Pete will have the meeting as usual.
Ms. Vincent?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. Some people may have heard that I donated $5,300. It was $350 in case there was an error. Thanks.
Michelle? Mr. Cox? Ms. Hodson? All right, well, thank you all for coming out. Thank you to our police, as always, for hanging out and keeping us safe, and kept the chief here all night, too. So we are adjourned at 8:58.